Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Working in the Woods, Archives, Labor, and Forestry in British Columbia. I'm pretty excited to have the three speakers with you today, Henry John, David Lang, and Claire Williams. Each one of them brings a great deal of information on the BC timber industry, and I'll let them introduce themselves as they get started. If you hold all your questions to the end, the three of them will be glad to answer whatever you've got to throw at them. So go ahead, David, or Henry, you're first.
All right. Hello, everyone. Just want to make sure y'all can hear me and see me. And I will be sharing my screen, so just bear with me. Whoop. That's the wrong one. Sorry. Doopy doopy doo. Oh, where is that? Oh, it was so easy earlier. Now it's just gone. What's going on there? Okay, sorry, folks. Let's try that again. Yes, yes. Okay, awesome. So yeah, my name's Henry. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of British Columbia History Department. I research the history of logging, unionism, and environmentalism on the South Vancouver Island area. And yeah, I also work in this funky little archive at the Katza Station Museum and Archives, where we are working with a collection of records belonging to the International Woodworkers of America. So yeah, I'll get started then. So I invite you to picture the scene: a sleepy archive annex of a small Vancouver Island museum, filled with boxes of paper records and the hum of fluorescent lighting. The morning's peace was suddenly broken by the museum manager marching into the annex, triumphantly waving 5 pieces of paper. "I've got it," she shouted. "I've found the finding aid." And this jubilation was most certainly warranted, for those pieces of paper were a guide to the records of the Cowichan Valley's International Woodworkers of America Local 180, and a key to unlocking a collection of forestry union records that held almost 100 years of labor history and local pride. I was hired by the Katza Station Museum and Archives in 2020 through the University of British Columbia's Arts PhD co-op program to arrange and describe a larger set of records acquired by the museum, those of the IWA's Canadian National Office. However, I was perplexed by this small filing system of records already at the museum. It was compiled by local woodworkers to document the early history of labor organizing in the Cowichan Valley. When this cabinet was donated to the museum by the Local 180 in 2010, the archivist at the time had assigned a number system to designating the fonts, the series, sub-series, and in some cases sub-sub-series that was only intelligible with the use of an accompanying finding aid. With the only information on the collection's folders being those numbers, and the finding aid's location becoming a mystery due to the aforementioned archivist's sudden departure, for my first 4 months working at the museum, I could make neither head nor tail of this confounding collection of documents. However, with the discovery of the finding aid, this cloud of confusion lifted, and the collection became navigable once more. The very form of these records, their archival production, and the choices made in their storage and promotion, tells a story of the rise and fall of unionism, the struggles over communism that gripped the union, and ultimately the significance of this culture of unionized woodworkers. But before I get there, I'll give you a brief history of the International Woodworkers of America in the Cowichan Valley and beyond. So in the Cowichan Valley, unceded Cowichan and Subasut territories on so-called Vancouver Island, class-conscious organizing in the woodworking industry predated the formation of the IWA. Communist-leaning organizers Hilmar Berggren, Ernie Dauskog, Fred Wilson, Edna Brown, and Owen Brown were active in the camps throughout the early 1930s, clandestinely battling the threats and realities of violence from company bosses. They were successful. They organized the first unionized logging camp in British Columbia at Lake Logging in 1935 and joined the structure of the IWA in 1937, thus formally receiving their credentials as IWA Local 180. The broader union was founded in 1937 as well in Tacoma, Washington, at a special convention of the Federation of Woodworkers. The 1940s saw explosive growth of the union. However, following the passing in the US of the Taft-Hartley Act, the union was rocked by post-war struggles between communist and anti-communist factions. In 1948, when the communist-leaning British Columbia district officers and local unions associated with them decided to split from the International Union and form the Woodworkers Industrial Union of Canada, the WIUC, or as they are colloquially referred to as the WUIs, rank and file members voted to remain with the IWA. A new, reformist, anti-communist leadership took the reins of woodworking unionism across the province, while the older generation of organizers were blacklisted from the union. So much of a form of the 180 legacy archive is a product of this 1948 split. Union records, such as meeting minutes and operation files, are almost totally missing from the pre-split era. And there's some disagreement regarding the fate of these early records. Some maintain that a WUI officer took them and they were eventually burnt. Others are adamant that it was the new reformist officers of the IWA that destroyed the records in order to invalidate the work done by their predecessors. It's certain that the new administration of the local union created a historical memory of events leading up to the split with the intent of incriminating the communist-affiliated WUI organizers. Some of the earliest documents to be found in the Legacy Archive came from this guy, Joe Morris, who was president of the local union between 1948 and 52, and would later serve as the IWA's BC president. Morris's accounts of events of 1948 emphasize that the split was, quote, a direct threat to the freedom of the labor movement. And he often repeated claims that the Cowichan-based officers had stolen furniture, equipment, staff, and funds from the local office. And this was in spite of a court hearing demonstrating that this charge was baseless. Such rhetoric and accusations permeate the meeting minutes, correspondence, and documents of the 1950s and 60s that would eventually become the 180 Legacy Archive. The consolidation of such documents into the Legacy Archive didn't occur until the mid-1970s, when IWA Local 180 President Roger Stanier, on the left here, formally set aside space for the collection of historical documents and photographs. Ken McEwen, who was the editor of the local union newspaper, was assigned to administer the archive. And around this time as well, the local union began encouraging old-timers to engage in the process, particularly in identifying and donating photos. Perhaps the apex of this process of gathering historical fragments, came with the local union's $10,000 purchase of a Wilma Gold photograph collection in 1983. Gold had roved the logging camps and mills of the coastal region during the 30s and 40s, taking photos of crews laboring in the forest industry, and upon purchasing the collection, the local union then began displaying them at public events, harkening back to the olden days in an attempt to draw new interest and new membership for the union. And so, following the theoretical footsteps of anthropologist Anne Stoler, we can posit that the very production, conservation, and dissemination of this archive has as much historical significance as its contents. That the local union held the resources to hire a dedicated archivist and publisher, to purchase expensive photo collections, and to organize old-timer events for identifying photograph subjects tells much regarding the state of the union during the 1970s and 80s. This was the high point of organized labor, the flourishing of the IWA in terms of size and resources. And tellingly as well, during this time period, local 180's lay historian, Ken McEwen, began interviewing formerly blacklisted WUI organizers and filling the archive with the transcripts of these interviews. In reconnecting and preserving the perspectives of early organizers such as Hilmar Berggren, Ernie Dausgog, and Owen Brown, the Union historian demonstrated that the organization had moved on from a Red Scare-style anti-communism of the 1950s. Instead, as the Union drifted further into bureaucratization, its radical roots became something to celebrate rather than silence. And later on in the 1990s, the addition to the legacy archive of the papers of Edna Brown, founder of the Lake Cowichan Women's Auxiliary of the IWA, and BC District Auxiliary President between 1938 and 1948, not only showed a continued desire to connect to these radical grassroots of the local union, but it also represents what was a growing concern with considering perspectives beyond the male-dominated leadership of the Central Union. Indeed, the 1990s saw a flourishing of women's labor history, most notably in BC in the work of Sarah Diamond, who, amongst other things, extensively interviewed members of both the Lake Cowichan Women's Auxiliary of the IWA and the BC District Auxiliary. So, my biggest takeaway from my work at the Kansas Station Museum and Archives is that for many involved in the preservation of this heritage, being a woodworker and unionist is and was more than just a job. Instead, it is and was a class-conscious identity, linked to a historical tradition of radicalism, grassroots struggle, and battling the oppression of logging bosses and capitalist corporations, which for many was also entangled with generations of family history. It was the strength of this identity that carried the 180s heritage program through the ravages of the neoliberal 1980s and 1990s. It's difficult to emphasize strongly enough the impact that tech change, mill closures, offshoring through raw log exports, and so-called streamlining of company work structures had on the IWA at the local level. Some brief stats here. In 1979, local Union 180 had an average of 4,725 members. But by 1989, this figure had dropped to 2,750. Even worse, the Victoria Local Union 1118 dropped from 2,500 members to only 99 and was eventually absorbed into its northern Cowichan neighbor. The ensuing drop in income from membership dues had a critical impact on the local's finances, and in turn on its heritage program. As a result, Union archivist Ken McEwen was let go at the end of the 1980s, and the conservation program was sustained by voluntary labor. In 1990, Alan Lundgren began volunteering to maintain the multiple collections of photographs, presenting them in public forums, including at this very conference, the Pacific Northwest Labor History Association conference. And part of his volunteer role was writing his own histories of the Union, assisting in the production of multiple books, including Ken Druska's famous book, Working in the Woods. Al was a seasoned faller and a member of the 180 Safety Council, while his father, Henry, was a charter member of the IWA, vice president of Local 71 in 1937, and the business manager for the Lumber Worker newspaper in 1938. So it was this intertwined potency of family history and woodworker pride that carried the archive forward into the 2000s. In 2014, buoyed by financial contributions from the community and thousands of volunteer hours, the Kansas Station Museum constructed its IWA annex to house its hoard of labor union and forestry records, including the 180 Legacy Archive. A crew of former woodworkers provide volunteer maintenance and construction to both the archive and the adjacent museum. And it's truly remarkable what they are able to achieve on a shoestring budget. And this guy, former IWA member and United Steelworkers staffer John Mountain, has volunteered almost 80 hours a month for the last 2 years to support the process of collecting and arranging records. Hence, this grassroots labor of heritage preservation and pride in labor heritage goes on. I'll close by asking, whose voices are missing in this narration of local labor history? Because while early photos show us Cowichan-based woodworking crews that were incredibly diverse in their racial and cultural makeup, union leadership has been almost exclusively white. This has created important silences in this archive. This photo in particular tells of one such silence, an entirely Japanese work crew at Hillcrest Logging in Satlam in 1940, who only a year later would have been placed in wartime concentration camps, an event which is totally absent from a 180 legacy archive. The same can be said for the genocide of indigenous peoples in Cowichan, Subasat, Dididat, and Pachidat territories, where children were sent to some of the worst residential schools in Canada, a human rights abuse totally ignored in the woodworkers' heritage displayed in the 180 archive. Even positives, such as the highly successful work of IWA organizer Darshan Singh, unionizing South Asian workers at operations throughout the Cowichan Valley and beyond, are barely mentioned in the legacy archive. As such, this discourse of anti-oppression that characterizes woodworker histories must be tempered with an understanding that the union structure was still located within a broader system of white supremacy. So how can we unsettle this tilted depiction of Cowichan's woodworking past? Well, two projects seem to be making good headway in doing so. So the first is the BC Labour Heritage Centre's collaboration with the South Asian Studies Institute of the University of Fraser Valley, which is foregrounding the role South Asian workers played in the labour politics of British Columbia and in places like the Cowichan Valley. And I would highly encourage you to attend Dr. Nushe Malik and Bailey Garden's panel, which is following this one, where they'll be discussing this. And the other example is the exciting new partnership between the Katsa Station Museum and the Subasat First Nation, documenting and displaying a history of forestry in the area that prioritizes Indigenous accounts. Ultimately, such community collaborations are essential if we are to fully understand the complex interplays of oppression and anti-oppression that undermine forestry and labor activism on these lands. And yeah, thanks everyone. I'll take questions at the end. Otherwise, I will stop sharing and it's over to Dave.
Well done, Henry. Thank you very much. My name is Dave Lang, and I am the junior member of this panel in a lot of ways, because I'm just working on a master's thesis at the University of Victoria, whereas my colleagues have already completed that kind of work. I'm interested in the history of raw log exports because nobody's written a book on that yet, despite raw log exports sort of being brought up every time there's forestry controversy in British Columbia. So while I was doing my research for my master's thesis, I came across two unpublished journals from a fellow named J.S. Emerson. I was fortunate enough to be given copies of these journals by Emerson's great-grandchildren. So I've written something about how Emerson fits into the early years of the log export controversy, and I would like to share that with you now. Let me share the screen. All right. So during the early part of the 20th century, Vancouver logger and businessman J.S. Emerson engaged in a series of running battles with the government of British Columbia over the province's raw log export control laws. The newspapers loved Emerson, who could always be counted on for a controversial quote, and Emerson loved the attention. In the fall of 1905, he dared officials to try to stop him from exporting his logs. The Department of Lands and Works accepted his challenge the next day. Surveying the wreckage, the Vancouver Daily Province wrote, "A whirlwind of official activity centered over Broughton Island last week, and the tugs, logging plants, camp equipment, and log booms of Mr. J.S. Emerson became mixed up in the vortex. Everything he owned was seized by the government. Today, Mr. Emerson is busily scanning the landscape from his balloon, and between looks, trying to throw out an anchor to steady himself and his property in the face of the hurricane of official displeasure." Reading stories like this, it would be tempting to conclude that the British Columbia government took its commitment to prevent the export of raw logs seriously. However, on closer examination, it becomes clear that while the government would act when publicly confronted, loggers who were willing to work behind the scenes often found ways to export. Although Emerson lost his battle, by the time of his death in 1921, industry and government had worked out a compromise that allowed some raw log exports but kept the issue out of the headlines. James Sharp Emerson was born in Ireland in 1858 and emigrated to America with his mother and sisters in 1884. He tried his hand at a variety of occupations, including real estate speculation, insurance sales, and meat packing, losing his family's inheritance in a series of bad business deals in Kansas and Missouri before getting involved in the logging business in the state of Washington in 1894. He was a devoted family man who wrote in his journal that his mother was the best and truest friend I ever had. He was a fiercely competitive businessman who admitted that the system we adopt in business is not the golden rule by any means, but it is the rule, and in self-preservation we have to follow it or starve. He was litigious and relished meeting his adversaries in court. His lawyer once attacked the credibility of a hostile witness by pointing out that Emerson had been involved not in 7 or 8 previous legal actions as the witness claimed, but in more than 50. He moved to Vancouver in 1899, eventually becoming one of the richest men in British Columbia, writing that making money seems so easy as to look immaterial to me, and I often wonder if I am not dreaming. British Columbia's forests were becoming particularly attractive to investors at the turn of the century for a variety of reasons. As the forests of the eastern United States were cut, lumbermen looked for trees elsewhere. This map shows how the focus of the industry moved south to Louisiana and then north and west to Washington state. As demand increased, the price loggers paid for the trees they cut, known as stumpage, increased as well. In 1899, Frederick Weyerhaeuser purchased 900,000 acres of timberland from the Northern Pacific Railway in Washington state, becoming the second largest private timber owner in the U.S. According to historian Robert Ficken, after Weyerhaeuser's move, stumpage rates doubled. Adding to the pressure on the supply of logs in Washington state, U.S. federal authorities began to prevent loggers from cutting timber on government land. Reporting on one trial, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer announced that the case is of no great importance, outside of the fact that it shows that the government has at last resolved to enforce to the fullest extent laws which were for a long time a dead letter. Emerson appeared in the same court the following day, likely charged with the same offense, although it is not possible at the moment to confirm this due to COVID-related archival closures. While costs were rising in Washington state, across the border in British Columbia, the provincial government, which had narrowly avoided bankruptcy at the end of 1903, was holding a fire sale on timber licenses. Licenses were made transferable, and the restriction that prevented one person from holding more than one license was removed. Money and lumbermen poured in. By 1907, more than 17,000 licenses had been sold, covering 9 million acres, most of the province's available forests. Emerson was well positioned to participate in this bonanza, and by 1905 was responsible for nearly 5% of the province's annual cut. Purchasing provincial timber licenses wasn't the only way for loggers to gain access to British Columbia forests. The right to cut trees from a piece of land in the province is called tenure. Timber licenses are one form of tenure. Other forms of tenure included timber leases, hand loggers licenses, and land purchased from the provincial government known as Crown grants. The terms of these tenure agreements were constantly changed as government and industry fought each other for a larger share of the profits from British Columbia's forests. The complexity of tenure made it difficult for outsiders to understand how new laws affected the industry. During this period of increased American investment in British Columbia timber, Canadian wood products were prevented from entering the American market by tariff barriers. Under the terms of the Dingley Tariff, enacted by Republican President William McKinley on July 24, 1897, Canadian logs entered the U.S. duty-free. But timber and other manufactured wood products faced import duties that even Americans described as almost prohibitory. The Detroit Tribune warned American protectionists that they had carried this business farther than good sagacity would warrant, adding that the tariff practically prevents the Canadians from manufacturing their own natural product on their own soil, for if the Canadians are excluded from our markets, their manufacture is largely destroyed. To add insult to injury, American wood products entered Canada duty-free, which meant that American lumbermen could import Canadian logs, manufacture them into lumber or shingles, and then use those products to compete with Canadian manufacturers in Canada. Ontario's provincial government was the first to respond by banning the export of raw logs in January 1898. Pressure mounted in British Columbia as newspapers reported on the success of Ontario's laws, and BC's Lieutenant Governor Henri-Gustave Joly de Lotbinière, a Quebecer with a forestry background, urged the provincial government to follow suit. Despite the public support for export controls, the provincial government showed no great enthusiasm for the idea. In May of 1901, an amendment to the Land Act was introduced in the legislature without fanfare. This amendment prohibited the export of trees cut from timber leases, but not from other forms of tenure. The Vancouver Daily Province praised the move, arguing that log exports had long been a crying evil and that the new law was merely a case of legitimate protection for British Columbia industry against unfair competition from a rival country. Loggers, however, were not happy and formed the British Columbia Loggers Association, which Emerson would eventually become the president of, to demand that the law be repealed. The BCLA quickly received assurances that the law would not be enforced until 1902 from the minister responsible, a former sawmill owner from Ontario named W.C. Wells. When 1902 arrived, Wells promised that requests to export would continue to be considered on a case-by-case basis. Seeking to clarify exactly what logs were covered by the government prohibition, the BCLA announced plans to challenge the law in court, which prompted the government to pass an order in council that extended the prohibition to logs cut from timber licenses as well as timber leases. This established a pattern where the government, satisfied with the status quo, tightened export controls only when publicly challenged by loggers. In the fall of 1902, the Vancouver Daily Province reported that a good deal of timber is still being exported to Washington in spite of the restrictions of the log export law. This is not surprising, since the export controls were difficult to enforce. There was no requirement for loggers to mark the logs they cut in a way that identified what type of tenure they were cut from. And since logs cut from Crown grants and hand loggers' licenses were exportable, loggers who wished to export claimed, if challenged, that their logs came from those types of tenure. In addition, the provincial government hired only 3 timber inspectors to enforce all of the timber-related regulations for the entire province. This, despite having room in the budget to fund 6 cleaning staff for the Parliament buildings. The number of timber inspectors was only slowly increased, and by 1913 there were just 9 inspectors covering the much expanded industry. In 1905, newspapers reported that log exports were continuing. The Canada Lumberman Trade Journal wrote that while the government strenuously denied that any logs were being exported, it was a well-known fact, in short the timber inspector here was cognizant, that cedar was constantly shipped. Emerson, who is now the president of the BCLA, wrote in his journal that I am exporting all my cedar logs to Puget Sound, where there is a good market for my output. Once again, negative press coverage and Emerson's public defiance forced the government to act, resulting in the seizures mentioned earlier. Emerson claimed he was being singled out by the government and threatened to expose other loggers who had also been exporting their logs. The BCLA lost its patience with Emerson and forced him from the presidency in 1906. Following Emerson's ouster, the BCLA developed a more conciliatory strategy in its negotiations with government over raw log exports. Rather than challenge the government's right to regulate the trade, the loggers attempted to gain public support by building business cases that supported their requests. In 1908, the BCLA asked for permission to export due to a large surplus of logs that were in booms in the water waiting for buyers. Unless permission to export was granted, the BCLA claimed that at least $500,000 worth of logs would be eaten by teredo worms. Permission to export logs that had already been cut was granted, although observers noted that this decision inspired loggers to head back to the woods and cut even more logs. When the First World War broke out in 1914, loggers again asked for temporary permission to export to clear a surplus of logs already in the water, which was granted, and then extended and extended again. In 1916, the Forest Act was amended to give the government the legal authority to allow exports whenever it pleased. By the end of the war, this had evolved into a committee system. Representatives of government, loggers, and manufacturers met regularly to review requests by loggers to export. Occasionally, members of the committee were themselves the largest exporters, though they of course did not vote on their own applications. This system essentially remains in place today. When Frederick Weyerhaeuser bought 900,000 acres of Washington state's timber in 1898, he hired George S. Long to manage his new acquisition, and more importantly, to manage public opinion. Weyerhaeuser was worried that public concern over the purchase would translate into legislation that would harm his interests. Long explained his strategy for dealing with this concern in a letter, writing that if you have such a thing as public sentiment to contend with, you want to study that very carefully and find out who really controls public sentiment, trying to get them friendly towards your interests and avoid doing things that will irritate the public. In other words, a man has to be a good fellow. J.S. Emerson's take no prisoners approach to combating raw log export controls alienated the public and annoyed the government. The leaders of the British Columbia Loggers Association who followed him took a more conciliatory approach, building arguments for export that were supported by public opinion. If Emerson had put more effort into being seen as a good fellow, his fight against raw log export controls may have been more successful. And with that, it's over to Claire.
Thank you, Dave. What a wonderful presentation. I just really appreciated that very revealing narrative. Let's see, I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Claire Williams, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I work as a forestry and natural resources archivist at Rare Books and Special Collections, UBC, Vancouver. I'm excited to join you today and briefly discuss historic photographs and the forestry industry in British Columbia. I hope by the end of our session, you'll come away with a deeper appreciation for the functional context surrounding historic photographs and be inspired to consider methods for interacting with photographs such as these to reconcile the complicated and ongoing legacy of resource extraction industries in North America, class struggles, indigenous rights to lands and waters, and the urgent climate crisis. A tall order, so let's get started. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I moved here as an uninvited person in September 2015 from the Bay Area of California, where I lived for most of my adult life on the unceded territories of the Miwok, Ohlone, and Amamutsun tribes, among others. I spent the first 16 years of my life living on 443 acres of land in what's now known as Sonoma County, California, located on the traditional territories of the Southern Pomo people. This land was run as an intentional community by a group of Quakers who collectively purchased the land, naming it Monon's Rill in the late 1970s. In the 2020 glass fire, this land was entirely devastated. Due to COVID-19 related border closures, I've yet to return home to see this devastation, but I share with you a photograph on the left here, which one of the community members took of the post-fire landscape. To the right of that image is an image from up here in Vancouver of a stump near Camosun Bog, or Munkum in the Hunkaminam language. I often walk through the bog, which contains many stumps of old growth trees cut by early settler colonists perhaps less than 100 years ago. I share these photographs with you as part of this land acknowledgement because to me they illustrate what settler colonial presence has historically done to lands in North America. Even Monon's Rill, which my high school friends affectionately called a hippie commune, has contributed to and been transformed by the seemingly inescapable legacy of settler colonialism, working in tandem with late capitalism and white supremacy, which has led us to extreme heat, severe droughts, fire season, and increasing climate-related crises. The First Nations of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, like First Nations all over North America, saw their lands transformed by these systems decades, centuries ago, as they are seeing them transform today. But I am against history repeating itself. I hope we might all view images such as these taken from very recent history, and those I'm about to show you taken from 1960 to 1969, in order to ask how we might better understand the complexities of the past, to use them as tools in our collective struggle for new futures. With that, I will turn to the photographs within the MacMillan Bloedel Ltd font at University of British Columbia, Rare Books and Special Collections. Font is a French term used in Canada, Europe, and Latin America to describe the records of a person or corporate body, similar to that of a records group in the States. MacMillan Bloedel, or MacBlo as it was often called, was a corporate forestry giant for much of the 20th century. The company traces its roots in British Columbia back to 1911 with the establishment of Bloedel, Stewart, and Welch logging. In 1919, Harvey MacMillan, along with W.J. Van Dusen, established the H.R. MacMillan Export Company Limited to sell British Columbia lumber on the world market. In 1951, the two companies joined to form MacMillan and Bloedel Ltd. The merger made the company one of the largest firms in the world engaged in both the production and sale of lumber. The 1960 amalgamation with the Powell River Company made the newly formed MacMillan Bloedel and Powell River Company one of North America's largest producers of newsprint. The name Powell River was removed from the corporate title at the annual general meeting of 1966, and the company became MacMillan Bloedel Ltd. I was hired in May 2019 to do a cleanup project on this font. It had been described before the Canadian rules for archival description were established and included over 400 boxes of textual records, 20,000 photographs, and about 1,000 maps, many of which were either misarranged or undescribed. Fast forward 2 years and one pandemic later, and I'm still wading through the materials in this collection, particularly the hundreds upon hundreds of corporate photographs. I've shown you just a few of these photographs here. Like many of the records in the font, they illustrate the processes integral to the forestry industry, the selling and transporting of timber, the processes that turn it into lumber and wood products, the buildings, machines, and humans who work to make these processes possible. Photographs in the fall range from mid-19th century to the late 1980s, but I'll be focusing on photographs in the period of 1960 to 1969 in this presentation. And the photographs I've just shown here in this slide were taken from 1960 to 1963. Now I want to shift gears a bit and introduce you to the concept of archival diplomatics. Particularly, I am interested in diplomatics as a tool to better understand and promote access to these photographs, to make them relevant to today's contexts. I draw heavily here on the work of Joan M. Schwartz, who is one of few archival theorists to write about the intersection of diplomatics and graphic materials. Schwartz states, quote, "Diplomatics is a 17th century discipline that seeks to identify, evaluate, and communicate the true nature of archival documents. It does so by studying their origins, forms, and transmission, as well as the relationships between documents and the facts represented, and between documents and their creators," end quote. I'm going to do my best not to get into too much archival terminology here. Basically know that diplomatics draws on a work published by Jean Mabillon in 1681, De Re Diplomatica, to help identify forgeries and duplicates of documents from originals. Luciana Duranty revolutionized the use of diplomatics in the Canadian archival context when she published a series of articles encouraging archivists to find new uses for this old science. Drawing on Schwartz's work, one of these new uses I would like to propose is the potential for diplomatics to invite a deneutralizing of archival records, as well as reparative, community-based parallel description of archival materials. Schwartz states, quote, "Photographs are documents created by a will for a purpose to convey a message to an audience. To understand them as the product of actions and transactions, either bureaucratic or sociocultural, we must return them to the action in which they participated. It is their functional context that transforms photographic images into archival documents." Later on, she goes on to say, quote, "Seen only in terms of their informational value, made accessible by name or place, archival photographs are robbed of their functional context and communicative power." The functional context of these photographs, or archival documents, if you will, were created under mustn't be erased. Indeed, it is my job in describing them to do my best to record and make clear the type of document, who created, for what message, what audience, what overarching purpose. I posit that it is through description which communicates functional context that archives, particularly archives of resource extraction, might be able to resist the legacy of neutrality. Schwartz insists, quote, "The ability of photography to use optical chemical transformations and Renaissance perspective to convey outward appearances with unparalleled accuracy does not negate its ability simultaneously to communicate carefully crafted messages for bureaucratic or corporate purposes. Archivists, therefore, must recognize that photographs, like maps, are linked to the exercise of government and business, and ask how they function as a silent arbiter of power, how they express an embedded social vision, and how they operate through the sly rhetoric of neutrality." Tim Schlack, in a more recent article on photographs in the archive, states, quote, "The testimony of images needs to be placed in a series of contexts in the plural, cultural, political, material, and so on. And in so doing, the historian and archivist need to read between the lines, noting the small but significant details, including significant absences, and using them as clues to information which the image makers did not know they knew, or to assumptions they were not aware of holding." In many of the corporate photographs, especially in the later half of the 1960s, there is an emphasis on machinery, buildings or landscapes, and a significant lack of images of laborers themselves. I found this particularly striking, especially when I considered the fraught tensions between organized workers and corporate employers in mid to late 1960s British Columbia. Reviewing newspaper articles for the period, strikes, particularly those of the IWA and the Longshoremen's Union, were being used to great success to halt the production of capital and gain workers' rights and advances. Ongoing strikes of thousands of workers or threats of strikes consistently appeared in conjunction with news reports on MacMillan Bloedel Ltd throughout the decade. Yet, if one were to review photographs in the fall from the same period, I doubt one would even be able to glean the fact that laborers were unionized, or indeed the massive labor force employed by the corporation, as workers were so often absent from their sites of work, represented by photographs in the collection. For example, take this image of the woodroom number 2, general view. The description captured in UBC's open collections tells the viewer the project the photograph was a part of and the creating body who authored it. It is up to the viewer, however, to interpret the meaning, the text of the visual image, what was meant by creating a representation of this room devoid of workers, as if the machines might work of their own accord. I am just a beginner when it comes to understanding the myriad processes and machines which are used in the fabrication of wood products, and it's possible this room is meant to be sparsely populated. However, even if that's the case, the pattern of empty spaces and rooms persists across the album, showcasing the expansion and so many other photographs within the corporate communications series. This emptiness is what prompted me to work on this presentation. When I began engaging with the concepts of archival diplomatics, I realized that the functional context of these photographs would always be situated within the context of the purpose of garnering MacMillan Bloedel a profit, having been created by corporate will. I believe those of us who are describing archival records could be even clearer, as honest as possible about this context. However, I also would like to invite users of historic photographs to contribute to this situating within wider historical contexts. I envision different communities using archives to collaboratively create parallel descriptions of digitized archival materials for their own functions and contexts. UBC's open collections, our repository for digitized materials, provides a space for users to comment on digitized photographs, but I find this space is rarely used. Many other online repositories have a similar feature, and I encourage you to use this space and to tell others to use it too, to note absences, clarify functions, and honestly situate the visual arguments presented by graphic materials within the intersections of class, race, gender, capital and labor, settler, colonial and indigenous, empire and sovereign nation, etc. I'll return to Short's again, quote, "The photographic image is inherently ambiguous. A photograph of clear cutting only becomes a document about progress for developers, jobs for lumbermen, logging practices for foresters, ruin for environmentalists, or territorial appropriation for native peoples when it is tethered to its functional context. Its true nature cannot be discerned from the form or even content of the photograph alone. Its evidential value, linked to a message of financial investment, labor opportunity, technological advancement, environmental degradation, or Aboriginal land claims, only becomes clear when the image is returned to its broader context of production, purpose, and use. The value of the photographic image and its role in the action in which it participated is not inherent in the content of the image or embedded in the intrinsic and extrinsic elements of form. Rather, it is anchored to the functional context of creation and cannot be teased from the image itself." End quote. This is so true for the print photographs in our collections. However, these print photographs are reproduced, just as all photographs are easily reproduced in the form of digital surrogates, which I've copied into this presentation. On this note, I'll conclude quoting Schwartz one last time. Quote, "The informational value of a photograph is fixed by its content. Its evidential value is neither absolute nor static, but rather varies with the multiple circumstances of document creation. A photograph created for one purpose may later be employed to serve others." Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions and comments now.
Wow, that was wonderful. I mean, I grew up in a big city, so I was absolutely fascinated by this. Let's see what kind of questions we have, because I don't even know where to start asking questions. I am absolutely so impressed by what I just learned. So let's see, what do we have? Let's see. A lot of congratulations, you guys. Nice one. Well done. This was lovely. Does anyone have a question about this? I actually see Judy there. I've never known her not to ask a question. Well, let me ask one. I was asking before. I mean, are any of these businesses still in effect? I know, Claire, you said that they weren't as big, but are they still operating up there?
Absolutely. The MacMillan Bloedel dissolved as a corporation, but several other smaller companies have taken place. Not any of them, you know, MacMillan Bloedel had this sort of corporate history as like BC owned and operated. And a lot of the ones operating now, I don't think are BC, although there are some, but none as that huge kind of almost monopoly that formed in the 20th century with MacMillan Bloedel. It's never been that giant.
Well, Henry and Dave, that was excellent. I learned more than I even imagined about the timber industry. And I really do appreciate you coming so much to this conference. I hope that you'll come back. We've got once a year, we present these, and you are wonderful. And if I don't see any, oh, here it is. What was the most surprising thing that you've learned so far in your research? From Donna. Thank you, Donna.
Henry, would you like to go first?
You go ahead.
I think when I started this project, I imagined that the raw log export controls were kind of a battle between government and capital around the use of these particular resources. And once I started looking into it, it became clear that and that the raw log exports were a bit of an anomaly compared to the rest of the forest industry. But in my opinion, it really fits the same pattern as the rest of the industry, where government knows that there are certain things that are popular with the public. So now, for example, not logging old growth forests. So they say that they're going to follow the public's wishes, not log old growth, work to combat raw log exports, and really they just continue doing what they've always been doing. And it's really a historian named Stephen Gray has written a lot about this. It's a partnership between government and capital to exploit these resources, and the public really doesn't have much of a voice at the table when those negotiations are going on.
Thank you, Dave. Henry and Claire, who would like to be next?
Go ahead. Oh, okay. I guess for me, Donna, it was so just striking. I worked on the International Woodworkers of America collections at Rare Books and Special Collections as a student archivist, and coming from that perspective to the MacMillan Bloedel materials. And, you know, I kind of expected there would be like some correspondence or photographs of strikes saying like, oh, you know, trying to quell them really, but instead there's just like this silence about it all. And that was shocking to me, but also kind of led me to say, well, how can we use the corporate photographs to really highlight the history that was going on? So thank you, a great question.
And I'll ask Dave the same, or I'll ask Henry the same question. What was the most surprising thing that you learned?
Well, working at a small rural archive with as chaotic a collection as the IWA records, there have been surprises every day. Sometimes multiple, some good, some bad. So I think I guess maybe the biggest thing I've learned from working here, which I guess maybe was a surprise, you know, I came into this job as a historian of environmentalism and someone who had previously worked for environmental NGOs taken part in environmental protests, often surrounding the old growth forests. And so my biggest takeaway is really what I was talking about with regards to the woodworker identity and culture, and how important that is when we start to address some of these questions regarding old growth forest. There's often these arguments presented by environmental groups that we can simply replace the jobs. Woodworkers will lose their jobs. They can get new jobs in tourism or in other industries. But really, when you consider this history, this heritage, this culture, this attachment to the identity of being a woodworker, really it's not as simple as a dollar-to-dollar match. There's this incredible sense of cultural loss when it comes to any form of job losses in this industry, and people scared that their children are going to have to move to the city to get jobs instead of staying in the woodworking industry. So I think that was my takeaway.
Well, to follow that up, Judy wants to know if there's a lot of effort at conservation. I'm not sure
Who's going to take that one?
Who would like to talk about conservation?
I'm just going to say it's a very tense topic right now in British Columbia. So I'm actually going to pass on this question because I'm working with multiple stakeholders right now on this very question. I do have my opinions, but I can't.
I'll go for it. I think, like I said when I was talking about what the biggest thing I learned was, I think the challenge is that it's difficult for a lot of reasons to make the changes that people would like to see be made. As Henry mentioned, within the industry, there's a culture to think about, and people don't want to lose that culture. Within the capital side of the industry, there are expenses involved in retooling mills to be able to handle second growth instead of old growth that firms don't want to make. And despite 100 years of claiming that we've been practicing sustainable forestry, British Columbia is running out of trees. So, sometimes it's a question, how long did we know that the cod were running out and we still ate them all? How long have we known that we're catching too many salmon and destroying the salmon habitat, and yet, we continue to do that? People have been warning for 100 years that we were logging at unsustainable rates, and we, as a culture, we seem to have a difficult time appropriately managing these resources that we have. And just to touch on some of the things that others have said today, that the culture today took from some other people, from the First Nations that lived here without their permission. Most of BC was not transferred by a treaty and was just taken.
Well, thank you, everyone. Claire, did you want to add something, or are you going to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think there's a lot of effort and that it doesn't result in a lot of change, as Dave was saying. And as an archivist, that's what I see over and over again in history, is that people in history work very hard to see changes. And we have those records of that effort, but then the result, it's difficult to arrive there.
Yeah, I believe that's the same issue we have in Washington State with logging. Thank you so much for coming and presenting your papers. It was wonderful, and I hope you will consider coming back our next time. Next up, we have 4 sessions coming. Let's see, it starts at 1:15. Rationalized bodies, the South Asian labor and activities of the British Columbia Organization to Fight Racism. Striking switchmen, railroad workers, unrest, and unionism in the United States and Canada 1888 to 1917, March of Innocence, which I understand is a very nice video movie, Red, Green, and International. So take a quick break, stay hydrated if you're in this part of the country and it's in the hundreds in your neighborhood. I know that's not usual for all of us. And choose your next workshop and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.